Welcome, Synod members. Before we begin, I would just like to ask the Chair of the Business Committee, Robert Hammond, to come and speak. Thank you, Robert. You have 2 minutes, sorry.
Thank you. I've never been given a time limit for this speech before. Synod, as you remember, the debate on the war in Ukraine was adjourned on Friday, and so the Business Committee would like to bring this back tomorrow morning. We also have had notification of a request to debate the deemed business Code of Practice under the Clergy Discipline Measure, GS 2281, so we need to find time for that as well. So, Chair, I would like to propose a change in the order of business so that the adjourned debate on item 6, the war in Ukraine, be taken on Monday morning after opening worship, but before item 21, the Archbishop's Council Annual Report GS 2267, and that the Code of Practice under the Clergy Discipline Measure GS 2281 be debated after item 501, the amending canon number 42. That, unfortunately, will mean that the Lincoln Diocesan Synod motion will, in absolute all probability, not be taken at this group of sessions, I'm afraid. I propose that.
Thank you. Under Standing Order 9, does Synod give its consent to me to vary the order of business as proposed? All in favour? Thank you. All against? Thank you very much. I would just like to let Synod members know that there will be chaplaincy support both in the foyer downstairs and during the debate and afterwards in the Berwick Saul building in the chapel. The chapel is also open at the moment if anybody needs quiet space. For this item, members will need GS 2266A and GS 2266B for this item. Can I invite Simon Eyre to come and speak to item 20? You have 10 minutes, Simon.
Thank you. Simon Eyre, Chichester 287. Thank you, Chair. Can I first of all thank all of those of you who signed this private member's motion to make this a possibility of this debate. I'm very, very grateful for that. And to the Business Committee for scheduling time. There are 3 strands to this debate, to the motion, but they are inextricably linked, and I hope I'll make that absolutely clear to you. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those who've pioneered and developed the practice of palliative care in this country over the last 70 years. Dame Sicily Saunders stands out as one with a lasting legacy. Now, perhaps her greatest achievement was the development and recognition of the concept of total pain. She came to understand that if people were struggling with uncontrolled physical pain, there are often psychological, spiritual, social, emotional elements to that. And it's become a principle on which our palliative care system has rested for the last 70 years. It's why specialists from a wide range of disciplines, not least hospital chaplains, have so much to offer in end-of-life management. Now, over those last 70 years, we've seen the growth and development of the hospice movement, and there are over 200 independently charitably funded hospices now, together with the palliative care services in our hospitals and in community settings. We have so much to be grateful for. But there is a problem. In March 2021, the Sue Ryder Foundation published a review of the levels of funding that hospices were currently receiving from their local healthcare commissioners and attempted to project the costs involved in the next 10 years. They thought £947 million would be required for this. The current level of government funding for palliative care stands at only 37% of that figure. The authors concluded that probably a 70% amount was required, allowing for charitable funding as well. in order to sustain the hospice infrastructure. Earlier this year, legislation was introduced for the very first time, making it mandatory for all integrated healthcare boards in England to provide and commission palliative care services. But while this is very welcome, unless the funding follows that, there is the very real risk of hospice closures. Now, one of the consequences of an inadequately funded palliative care system is it can be perceived as failing to deliver when it is most critically needed. For those of us who've had the privilege of working in general practice, the scenario of trying to manage a terminally ill patient at home when their condition is steadily deteriorating late on a Friday evening with no hospice bed and very overstretched community palliative care provision won't be unfamiliar. It is out of such scenarios that the problems arise, contributing to the increasing and growing call to legalise assisted suicide in the 10 years since this was last debated at General Synod. Since 2013, there have been 4 unsuccessful attempts made in Parliament to change Section 2 of the 1961 Suicide Act. Notably, on the 22nd of October last year, Baroness Meach's assisted dying bill was debated in the House of Lords, with many contributions from our own bishops. And on 16th of March this year, Lord Forsyth attempted to introduce an amendment to the Health and Care Act 2022, but that was defeated by a majority in the Lords. Even this last week, on Monday, the Petitions Committee of the House of Commons debated a government e-petition on this very subject. So why do we need to take our stand in this debate? First and foremost, I believe it is because the sanctity of life is central to our understanding as Christians. Genesis 2 reminds us it is God who breathes life into all of us. Psalm 139 tells us that all our days are known to God before they come into being. And Psalm 31 states that our times are in his hands. We need to hold firm to these truths. But beyond this, there are several cogent arguments for upholding the current legislation. There are several vulnerable groups for whom any change in the law would constitute a particular threat. We have an increasing number of people who have lost mental capacity in this country. There are currently over 1 million active lasting powers of attorney covering health and welfare. There is a very real risk with changed legislation that these LPAs could be used to prematurely end people's lives. Terminally ill patients often experience understandable depression and anxiety. With support and medication, often a person's feelings of hopelessness can be transformed. With a change in the law, a number might choose assisted suicide before receiving that help. Those with learning difficulties might be unable to comprehend what's being suggested to them, while those with disability have been drawn into legislation for assisted suicide where that has been legalised in a number of countries. The risk is that they could feel potentially pressurised into accepting assisted suicide to unburden those caring for them. And then finally, there's the situation where terminally ill people might themselves feel motivated to seek assisted suicide in the belief that they'd be easing their relatives' distress and to reduce the economic impact of their illness on the family. Also, there's a risk that unscrupulous relatives might take advantage of that, eyeing increasing care costs, eroding their inheritance. Then there are effects on medical practice to think of. Those working in palliative care may well feel their role is compromised. There's always been the recognition that increasing doses of medication, use of palliation of symptoms, can possibly lead to altered consciousness and respiratory depression, hastening death. But the intention has always been to alleviate symptoms, not deliberately and prematurely end life. A change in the law could dramatically alter that approach. There may be the risk of complaint or even legal action where the views of relatives clash with those looking after a patient if assisted suicide were to be refused. Certainly there is precedent for that in countries who have legalised assisted suicide. Conscientious objection might prove very difficult to negotiate with an unsympathetic employer, and there is the very real risk of doctors colluding. The requirement for 2 signatories, cited as a key safeguard by protagonists of assisted suicide, is no guarantee of a safety net. Finally, there may be genuine difficulty in the healthcare system meeting the change demands that change legislation would bring. In 2011, Canada, who are a country very similar to ourselves, were in a very similar situation. But following legal challenge, the Medical Assistance in Dying Bill, MAID, became effective in 2016, allowing both for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Initially, the legislation was restricted to those over 18 suffering from a serious physical health condition whose natural death was reasonably foreseeable. But following further legal challenges, there is no longer the requirement for somebody to be terminally ill, and a natural life of even up to 10 years has been accepted. From 2023, people with mental illness as their sole underlying medical condition will have access to MAID. There would be every prospect that any change in the Suicide Act in this country could eventually lead to similar consequences. It would be naive not to recognise that there are difficult scenarios to manage, particularly in motor neuron disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, where full capacity and consciousness remain intact, pose some of the sternest challenges. Also for many, in this day, their first direct experience of dying will be the death of a close family member. Now, if that is a difficult experience, clearly that is going to have a lasting impact. Perhaps the fact that the word agony was used 15 times in the Barris-Meacham debate in part reflects that. Our response needs to be an honest one, an honest admission that palliative care can fail to deliver its best at times. But it should also be our logical conclusion that we need to seek ever-improving excellence in palliative care services through training, research and investment, rather than enacting new legislation to allow assisted suicide as a route out of the problem. Now, some prominent voices would have us believe that the majority of Christians are in favour of assisted dying, and that somehow the leadership of the Anglican Church is out of step with its membership. Today, we have the opportunity to set the record straight by giving this motion our united and wholehearted support. We need to send the strongest possible message to our government about the need for the necessary investment in palliative care, to the people of this country that we care passionately about the needs of those reaching the end of their lives, and to provide reassurance to vulnerable groups that we will do our utmost to protect their welfare. Jesus said, "I have come that you may have life and life in all its fullness." Surely that's not only when everything is going well in our lives, but also in the difficult days that can come as life draws to a close. I beg to move this motion that stands in my name. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Simon. This item is now open for debate. I should let Synod know that we have had a lot of requests to speak, so I'm starting us with a 3-minute limit on speeches. Anyone wishing to speak would stand. Okay. Fiona Macmillan, Emily Hill, and Bishop James.
Thank you, Chair. Fiona Macmillan, 357 London. Today's motion helpfully draws on the experience of Canada, where, as said, despite the initial safeguards, after less than 5 years, assisted dying legislation was extended to include disabled people. It framed assisted suicide as an equality right. Inclusion Canada, a community of disabled people and their families who campaigned against it, had long feared that having a disability would become an acceptable reason for what they called state-promoted suicide. Since the decision, disabled Canadians regularly report that it's easier to get funding for supported dying than for supported living. The UK has become an increasingly unsafe place to be a disabled person, with statutory discrimination now hidden in plain sight. our government, particularly in its current form, would be no safeguard on this same slippery slope. The UN Convention on Disabled People's Rights was ratified here in 2009, but over the last 12 years, the government has consistently undermined disabled people's rights and autonomy. This was so marked that in 2016, the UN began an investigation into the treatment of disabled people in the UK, the first ever such investigation into a member state. Since the Welfare Reform Bill of 2012, support for disabled people to participate in family and community life has been repeatedly undermined, while media rhetoric such as benefits are a lifestyle choice or work is always good for your health has contributed to a rise in disability hate crime. Despite the familiarity around disability generated by the 2012 Paralympics, 2018 research by the charity Scope showed that 67% of the UK population hesitate even to speak to a disabled person. During the pandemic, sweeping do not resuscitate orders were issued to people with learning disabilities, dementia and autistic people, without their knowledge or consent or those of their families. A disproportionate number of those who died from COVID were disabled people. Recent research indicates this was more likely to be caused by discrimination than by underlying conditions. These all demonstrate a failure to value disabled people's lives. Past performance and current attitudes sadly signpost to future likely action. The slippery slope in Canada sets out a potentially terrifying future for disabled people in the UK, should assisted suicide legislation be adopted here. I urge Synod in the strongest possible terms to support this motion. Thank you.
Emily Hill, Hereford 322. Thank you, Chair, for calling me to make this my maiden speech. I'm speaking to you today not only as a member of this church and synod, but as a healthcare professional who has worked on a COVID respiratory ward since the beginning of the pandemic and witnessed or been involved in a countless number of deaths. The papers we've been provided as reading material before this debate are heavily biased towards this motion, with no alternative view being offered. I do not contest us showing appreciation for healthcare professionals and chaplains, or calling on Her Majesty's Government to provide adequate funding for palliative or end-of-life services. The statement used by the end-of-life team at my hospital is that we only have one chance to get this right. Currently, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are dying uncomfortable and painful deaths when they do not need to. I can attest that while we try to make the end-of-life process as pain-free and kind as possible, the standard treatment doesn't work for everyone, and sometimes people suffer. As Simon said earlier, Psalm 31:15 says, "My times are in your hands." This, among other pieces of scripture, is often interpreted to mean that we should not end our life too soon. But then surely the opposite is true, that we should not prolong it. And yet most, if not all of us, have taken antibiotics to treat an infection that could have otherwise been fatal. Most of us would appreciate someone performing life-saving treatment if you were to suffer from a cardiac arrest or choked on your afternoon tea. So why can we prolong life but not appropriately assist people to end it ever so slightly earlier to ensure peace? In GS 2266A, we are given 3 definitions of different types of assisted suicide, including assisted dying, where a patient is prescribed life-ending drugs to self-administer if they have less than 6 months to live, thus giving the patient control over how they die, giving them a chance to die how they see fit, giving them the right to choose their care. Yes, there are issues around safeguarding those who are vulnerable, but we are not called in this debate to work out the logistics of an assisted dying scheme, nor are we called in this chamber to actually change the legislation. We are called to ask the government whether or not we agree that certain patients should be offered the guarantee to die a good death. This motion forces us to view 3 separate issues as one. Can I recommend that Synod do more work on this area when we are allowed to debate the 3 definitions of assisted suicide separately? And therefore, can I ask you not to pass the motion as it currently stands?
as Synod, this is, I believe, an excellent and timely motion which I hope all of us can support wholeheartedly. As lead bishop for health and social care, I'm especially grateful for the positive reference to healthcare chaplains, the emphasis on good palliative care, and the clear call in paragraph C to keep the current law on assisted suicide. And I take the points about the different definitions that have been made. We're talking, I think, particularly here about the giving of poison by people who are suitably qualified to those who are nearing the end of their life. And that, of course, is the contentious part of the motion. As we've just heard, understandably, it arouses strong emotions on both sides of the debate. Emotions matter very much, but they are not the best foundation for making difficult ethical decisions. And the reasons why the Church of England has consistently and strongly opposed the legalisation of assisted suicide are very helpfully summarised, I believe, in the paper we received from the Secretary-General. I'd love to expand them all. There isn't, unfortunately, time, though you may be happy to hear that. But let me highlight three words, all conveniently beginning with the letter C, an expository preacher's dream, which recur most frequently in conversations about assisted suicide. The first, of course, is compassion, a profoundly Christian virtue which is often claimed as the sole prerogative of those who'd like to see the law on assisted suicide changed. Many of the tragic stories we hear make that a hard argument to resist and are deeply moving and disturbing. But the exercise of compassion applies not only to those nearing the end of their life, but also to the thousands of vulnerable elderly and disabled people whose intrinsic worth and very existence could be threatened by the legalization of assisted suicide. Compassion goes both ways. The second word is choice. I can see I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'll probably end on this, which has been described as one of the idols of our day. Surely, the argument goes, I have the right to choose the manner and time of my death, just as I have the right to choose where I live or what work I do. But of course, the choices I make don't only affect me, they also affect those around me, including, in this case, my family, my friends and neighbours, my doctor, and the norms and values of the society in which I live and die. Choice is by no means as simple as it seems, and is different from our God-given free will, which entails the freedom to become the people God has made and called us to be. The third word is control. I won't go into it now, though I could, but I would say that allowing people to die is different from assisted suicide, and when people get a grip on what assisted suicide means in this context, they can usually see very clearly why the Church of England has consistently resisted it, and I hope will continue to do so.
I'm now going to take a couple of speakers from Zoom. I'd like to call Canon Val Plum and then Priscilla White.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Just have to check the Zoom connection. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear anything from you guys. Can you hear me? I have always found this matter of assisted dying incredibly uncomfortable until life revealed to me that I equally find deep and painful suffering just as uncomfortable. The last words my mum ever said to me was, "I love you, and promise me that you won't let me suffer." I loved her so much, but I couldn't keep that promise. My mother died of pancreatic cancer. I nursed her with my sister till she went into a hospice. I won't share with you the tragic details, but let me say this right now, that no amount of superb hospice care could ever take away the indescribable look of terror and despair in my mother's eyes as she struggled to sit up just to vomit black sludge. That was the moment that I got down on my knees and I prayed so hard that God would take her, because I realized there and then that this wasn't a life being taken. Instead, it was a terrifying existence full of devastating pain, inexplicable suffering, and deep despair, and she deserved better. She was a deeply religious woman who throughout that time repeatedly asked if things could be speeded up, because heaven was her only relief. From that experience, I, along with others, have come to see assisted dying not necessarily as a shortening of life, but more about shortening death and thus reducing unnecessary suffering. Synod, I find it surprising that this motion has come forward, given that the Church's current policy is to have this issue examined by a Royal Commission, a policy adopted, I think, in 2014, the same year my mother died. I understand that at the time this was backed by senior clergy, including the Archbishop of York, John Sentime, about 8 years ago. So where is it? I also want to say, over 200 million people worldwide have the option of assisted death if they become terminally ill, including 11 jurisdictions in the US, all states in Australia and neighbouring New Zealand, closer to home, Scotland, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, all bringing forward assisted dying bills. So it's concerning me deeply that the rest of the UK is being left behind with unsafe, broken law. There is no law to stop people taking their own life, but there is a law to prevent them doing so under medical supervision in a more dignified way, instead of leaving themselves to be found by deeply distraught loved ones. One day this week, the MPs debated, amongst other things, assisted dying for the first time in over 2 years, with twice as many MPs in favour of the reform. Well, whatever your views on assisted dying are, I think we can all agree that we must protect the vulnerable. Therefore, I would seek some understanding as to why the Church believes this issue is ripe for a Royal Commission and yet is happy to predetermine all those efforts by staking its opposition via this motion today. If it is no longer policy to have a Royal Commission, could we be informed as to when that decision was taken and why? And finally, just to be clear, this is not a debate about investment in palliative care, which we all support. It's a debate about humanity and choice. Compassion is at the heart of Christianity. So, Synod, I urge you to oppose this motion so we can at least have the courage to explore it further, not just for us, but for those who really need our care. Thank you.
Thank you. Priscilla, would you like to speak?
Oh, I've just been right. Thank you. Priscilla White, Birmingham, 65. My voice is a little ropey, but I hope loud. I'm speaking today in favour of the motion. I'm wishing to share something of our experience as a family of the excellence of palliative care that the NHS provides. Hopefully it won't be too self-indulgently emotional. I've only story. 5 years ago, while on holiday in Italy, our daughter was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and a huge shout out for that health service, which managed to diagnose her quickly. We came home and she had a biopsy, and it turned out to be one of the nastier ones. She was treated and she spent some time in and out of hospital. In the last bits over last summer, she found herself in and out of hospital again and again. So then we had those words, "There is no more that we can do." Her firm wish was to die at home, and they did everything to get her home as soon as possible. Although she died after only about 10 days, it was as peaceful and good as it possibly could have been. As a family, we were there, she was safe, and we were able to love her across the line. So now I come to my own experience. I've had cancer for the last 7 years, and I hope that when it comes for me to finish that journey, I can have as peaceful a time as her. Now I've realised, and especially having just heard Val, that not everyone's experience is the same. And I know of others who have taken their own lives. But we can promote the fantastic work that the NHS does. And just to finish with a quote from Julie Norwich, which sustains us through all of this. God said not, thou shalt not be detested, thou shalt not be travailed, thou shalt not be diseased. But he said, thou shalt not be overcome. Thank you.
I'd like to call Bishop Graham Usher, Jane Patterson, and Nick Land.
Graham Usher, 029 Norwich. Friends, like many folk here, I speak having sat many times with parishioners who have died, and I count those times as amongst the greatest privileges of ministry. Only a few weeks ago, I sat for a number of evenings with an archdeacon colleague as he gathered the frailty of his ill body and prepared to die amidst the outstanding care of the Priscilla Bacon Hospice. Archdeacon Ian Bentley witnessed to many in those closing weeks, weeks that he saw not as closing, but opening ones into the mystery of God's eternal life and love. And as I sat there with him, I rightly pondered, probably like many of you who've ministered in such situations, on the nature of suffering, its deep complexities, which mean that there are no glib or easy answers. I pondered personal autonomy and freedom, which Bishop James has already mentioned, and I pondered about personhood. A former Archbishop of York, John Habgood, wrote this: the continuity of personhood is located not simply in a physical organism, but in a relationship with God, which is not destroyed when mind and body fail. Something important remains, he wrote, even in the most dysfunctional body. Life is God's precious gift, and every life carries intrinsic sanctity, significance, and worth. And I would suggest that dying well can only be understood in the broader context of living well. To live well is to prepare oneself to die well. It's often said that the Victorians were obsessed with death and avoided all talk of sex. Our culture seems to be obsessed with talking about sex and shies away from all talk of death. But part of the life of our church is to enable good talk about death, to help people to begin to trace answers to questions, to support people with the spiritual resources for a good death. Jeremy Taylor, writing in the 17th century in his work Holy Dying, summarized this entire matter. It remains, he wrote, that we who are alive should so live, and by the actions of religion attend the coming of the day of the Lord, that we neither be surprised nor leave our duties imperfect, nor our sins uncancelled, nor our persons unreconciled, nor God unappeased. In supporting this motion, please also support those who minister and those who encourage conversations to help us live well, to die well. Thank you.
Jane Patterson, Sheffield, 409. Thank you for calling me and thank you, Simon, for tabling this important PMM, which I wholeheartedly support. I will focus on one aspect of the issue, that of prognosis, which is applicable here. I declare an interest. Professionally, I am a consultant surgeon with a special interest in upper gastrointestinal disease. What I will say is an example from my practice, but is more generally applicable. Many, many times I have had the responsibility of breaking the bad news to a person that they have cancer, sometimes advanced cancer, which is beyond reasonable prospect of cure, and that the aim of care will be palliative treatment of their symptoms. After I have explained this as compassionately and clearly as I am able, what happens next? Most commonly, after saying thank you for my honesty, the person or someone with them asks, "How long, doctor?" In other words, what is the prognosis? Then I have had the challenge of explaining the extraordinarily difficult, or actually impossible, how impossible it is to even for somebody who is very experienced to predict how long one individual will survive. We do not know where the person in front of us is in that spectrum. Will they survive for an average length of time, beyond or less than that? Sometimes even this information is not available. Sometimes we get it wrong. Concern about length of life as well as quality of life are chief among patient and carer concerns, as we have heard today. And so I urge us to regard the premise of a defined prognosis in terms of survival time, on which any proposed legislation on assisted dying or suicide is based, to be fundamentally flawed and therefore to be opposed. Let us work to help people understand this concept. And yes, let us call on the government to fully resource the palliative care services that they have committed that the NHS will provide, to close the funding gap and to resist any change in the current legislation. Both patients and carers who find themselves distressed and vulnerable in these highly stressful situations need us to do this. As believers in the Creator, eternal God, the giver and sustainer of life, let us support this motion. Thank you.
Nick Land, York 437. I'm a psychiatrist, and as such I've also had a medical legal practice in the Court of Protection, doing capacity assessments on vulnerable people wishing to make life-threatening decisions. No one could not have been moved by what Val Plum has just told us. But the issue and the problem we have is that no legislation, no jurisdiction has been able to devise a way of having assisted suicide in a way that it does not rapidly expand to a whole range of other vulnerable people. It starts with people with terminal illness in great pain, then it's the non-terminally ill in pain, then the chronically ill children, and then the mentally ill. And on top of this, when you have assisted suicide, it begins to put intolerable pressure on vulnerable people. Vulnerable people who already feel that society does not value them. And if suicide was available to them, their guilt in not opting for it to free their families from their perceived burden of care begins to overwhelm them. Let me tell you a story about my mother, which I tell with her permission. She's got Lewy body dementia. She's had that for several years. She's in chronic pain. She's got very poor mobility. I went to see her 6 weeks ago. She was lying in bed and she was weeping. She said, "Nick, please help me die. You've got to help me die. I can't cope anymore." She's a Christian. She said to me, I just want to go home. I talked to her, I prayed with her. I did think perhaps as well she has depression. Interestingly then she said, and what can I pray for you? Despite her level of distress, and my wife, who's a wiser woman than I am, reflected back to her how even in her pain and her disability, she was still a prayer warrior who could pray as she had done for decades for us as a family. 6 weeks later, I went to see her earlier this week. She was up. She was cheerful. She'd just come back from a service in her residential home where she was really excited that she'd taken 2 fellow residents who'd never been to church to the service. The thing is, depression is very common in chronic illness. It's very common in pain. If we do not have good palliative care, liaison psychiatry services, people will opt for assisted suicide rather than get the treatment that would prolong their lives and their happiness. But perhaps even more clearly, no human community has been able to find a way to create legal structures which allow those with capacity to opt for suicide without simultaneously putting vulnerable people in large numbers at risk. So whilst I have every compassion for the story that Val Plum tells, the reality is if we have assisted suicide, thousands and then millions across the world will be put to death without their permission because we cannot find ways of protecting them. Every human being is created in God's image. Our value is in his sight, not by what we can do. Thank you.
I'd like to call Bishop Sarah. Do I see Paul Matthias? Matthews, sorry. Yes. I'm Benjamin John. Thank you. I've just been asked to say for the people joining us on Zoom that if they need to use chaplaincy services, they can email Synod support. Thank you.
Sarah Mullally at 003 London. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. And also thank you for all those who in this debate are sharing their personal experiences. I know that must be coming at a cost. I have, over the years, had the privilege of seeing some of the best palliative services in the world here in this country. And I know that these services make a difference not just to the individual that is dying, but also to family and friends, and also staff. It has always been my view, even when I was in government, that the UK government does not properly fund palliative care services. The government depends upon charitable giving, and whilst that is great, it is not adequate or appropriate. Not funding properly palliative care services leads to not just unequal access, but it also leads to difficult deaths. And therefore, if this government takes seriously the idea of enabling people to die well, the funding needs to be put in not just into palliative care services, but also into palliative care research. And as Nick just suggested, that is where the link is with assisted dying. Also, part of good palliative care is also good bereavement care. And I have recently, over the last year, chaired the UK Commission on Bereavement. And as a result of that, I have heard of all the hurdles that so many people have had to good access to bereavement support. And of course, that not only affects the death that they are facing, it affects their death and their dying when it comes. Every person who faces death of someone who is significant in their lives should not do this alone, but have access to good bereavement care. Of course, clergy and the church are significant. They play a significant part in providing bereavement care, and that in turn is significant to palliative care. We play our part. The UK Commission on Bereavement is a partnership of charities and researchers. It will produce its recommendations in September, part of which is encouraging recommendations on the government, but also on us as providers of bereavement care and palliative care. I would encourage us as a church and us as clergy to look out for those recommendations so we can play our part in improving bereavement services and palliative care in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just minded to move the speech limit to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Mathams, Jersey Channel Islands, 406. I speak in relation to the last part of the proposed resolution, that concerning assisted suicide. I speak in favour of it, but I do consider it essential that we develop further our understanding of the difficult issues raised, and I do so in the context of recent events in my own home island of Jersey. As many will know, in Jersey we're not part of the UK, we have our own parliament, we make our own laws, and last November our parliament voted in favour of the principle of assisted dying. Legislation is presently being prepared. It will come before the States, the Parliament, in November, and by this synod next year we may well have on the statute book within the British Islands, one of the parliaments in the British Islands, a law on assisted dying. There are safeguards in the in-principle approval, but of course they're not set in stone. We don't know what will be in the legislation. And then also, of course, as has already been raised, there is the issue of so-called mission creep. We've heard many personal experiences, and I won't go into detail of my own, but when my own mother died last year, I prayed so hard that she would be taken and that she would be taken home quickly when it came to the end of her life. So whilst I fully support the motion, I do urge that we discuss further in our dioceses, in our deaneries, that we develop our understanding of the difficult issues raised in order that we may constructively participate in the debate. It's an issue, Synod, that will not go away. Thank you very much.
Benjamin John, St Albans 395. Thank you for calling me Chair. The Oregon 2021 statistics paint a picture of the concerns of those choosing this pathway. 93% fear of losing autonomy, 92% less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, 68% loss of dignity, 54% feeling like a burden on family, friends, and caregivers. What does it mean to have dignity? What does it mean to have autonomy? We hear that often value of life is tied to quality of life. To have autonomy is when those abilities are taken away, we're worth less. Life is not worth living. But the reality is that we're not autonomous. God is. And in some sense, our bodies are not ours. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. What we do with our bodies matters, and these awful, horrible stories of pain and suffering, but whatever euphemism we use, suicide is still suicide, and murder is still murder. But how can we offer hope in the face of death? The Bible is realistic, but it's an opportunity to show Christ's love to others by serving those who are most vulnerable. Dignity means showing people who are dying that they are still valued, not like dogs to be put down. Stepping into those messy, hard situations and showing compassion, suffering with. Whoever you are, whatever you're going through, whatever your bodily functions, you are not a burden. And Jesus invites you, weary and heavy laden, to himself to give you rest. So we call them to Christ, to the hope that we have of the eternal kingdom when we will receive new bodies, where there will be no more death and pain and suffering, and where we will rejoice in the presence of our Saviour. So let us join with Job in crying out that the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
If I could ask Bishop John to go next, and then I will test the mind of Synod whether we'll have a motion for closure. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. John Inge, 42. I'm grateful for this motion, and I want to follow on from what Jane Patterson said about prognosis. My wife Denise died on Easter Day in 2014. After a year's battle with cancer, leaving two daughters aged 15 and 10, she was 51. How easy it would have been when she was given that terrible prognosis that she had terminal cancer to give in, to succumb to despair. And if assisted dying had been legal, I'm sure that she would have been very, very tempted to opt for it. As it was, the quality of her life at the time of her diagnosis and following it was pretty poor by any standards. We were all depressed. However, against the odds, the chemo that she was given did have an effect, and the tumour shrank for a while. Had assisted dying been legal, we might never have had the opportunity to enjoy the precious months together that we were given following that terrible diagnosis. And the despair of the moment could so well have become determinative. What a tragedy that would have been. As it was, Denise was able to emerge from the darkness of the initial diagnosis and the trauma of the treatment which followed to enjoy some precious time. As she wrote shortly before she died, contemplating mortality is not about being prepared to die, it's about being prepared to live. And that's what I'm doing now, more freely and more fully than I have since childhood. The cancer has made life not made life more precious. That would make it seem like something fragile to lock away in the cupboard. No, it's made it more delicious. As this motion suggests, our energies should be directed towards assisting people to live with dignity, not assisting them to die.
I now wish to test the mind of Synod on whether item 20 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 20. Those in favour of the motion for closure on item 20, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. It's carried. I now invite Simon to respond to the debate. You have 4 minutes. Thank you.
5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I think if nothing else comes out of this debate, then I think you will have become to understand the complexities of what is involved. I want to say a heartfelt thank you, and I mean this to Valerie particularly for sharing her experience. I'm sure there are many other untold stories, perhaps in this chamber, which might mirror that. And it is very painful to have to hear those stories where palliative care has failed. It's not been able to deliver what it might. She mentioned the Royal Commission. That is a decision for Parliament. That's not within our remit. I'm very grateful to Emily for her experience from COVID. NHS was in a terrible state during COVID. And I think it was seen and trying to perform under the most strained of conditions. I worked for NHS 111 for a year, and through April and May 2020, they were some of the most difficult years, probably months that I had experienced as a practitioner. I'm grateful to Fiona for highlighting the particular aspect of disabled people, and I think they would be very, very much at risk from any legislative change. I'm grateful to Bishop James for clarifying with his 3 C's the importance of palliative care and the end-of-life end-of-life care. Priscilla White, I think, gave us, if you like, that balancing thing where palliative care really has performed well. When you're considering how to vote, it is a tension. It's a tension between what palliative care can offer and those difficulties. But what I've tried to put before you is that the root of the problem is actually that we have palliative care that is not sufficiently comprehensive at the moment, and it isn't providing the care that is needed. We only have one palliative care consultant per 100,000 population at the moment. We only have one palliative care consultant for every 1,000 deaths in this country. That is not enough, and that's what we would be appealing to the government to rectify. I'm thankful for the Bishop's interventions, Bishop Graham and also Sarah, for your insights from your time in government, and also to Bishop John and his story of his wife's death, but in a sense the hope that there was in that period and the joy that they had. Prognosis was mentioned. Thank you, Jane, for highlighting that. It is a very difficult area. I always hesitated to try and give a prognostic time when I was working. It's impossible. And I have many experiences. I would just give you one example. A young woman who had a chondrosarcoma of the skull, which is a malignant tumour of the skull, and was given 3 months to live. She registered with me after she'd been alive for about 6 months. She was still registered with me when I retired. She must have survived 15 years. Those things happen. They do happen. And prognosis has also been further complicated by new and innovative treatments, where conditions that were previously thought to be hopeless, we now have people who respond and people who don't respond, and deciding who's going to be helped is difficult. I'm going to finish, and please, I do apologise if I missed anybody, but I want to just reflect on the sermon this morning. It was the Good Samaritan. Now, what the Good Samaritan did was he came alongside that man, and he journeyed with him. That's what we're called to do. We're called to journey with people through their terminal illness. We're not called to cut it off early. It may be difficult, but we're still called to journey, to give love, care, make people still feel valued, even in their very final days. I thank you for all your support, and I thank you for all your contributions. Thank you.
I now put... Yes, please come to the microphone.
Point of order. John Wilson, Lichfield 341. Given the importance of this item and the fact that we're asking for action by Her Majesty's Government, it is important that we have an accurate record of the vote. I wonder if you would order a count of the Synod.
Yes, I would do that. Thank you very much. Do I see 25 people standing? Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Point of order.
Madam Chair, Simon Butler, 221. This has been a very moving and thoughtful debate, and I think it would be good if we could pray before we voted, simply because of the way in which people have spoken, and I wonder if you or someone might be called to lead us in prayer.
Thank you. Let's have a moment of quiet, please. Lord, you created and fashioned us. You know us and search us out. You abide with us through light and dark. Help us to know your presence in this life and in the life to come, still be with you, where you are alive and reign, God, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you, Synod. This is a counted vote of the whole Synod on item 20. Those present in York using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. And those wishing to record an abstention, press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using buttons on the screen. I'm afraid I've started the voting process. Sorry. You can raise a point of order after the vote.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
Counted vote of the whole synod results as follows. In favour, 289, against 25, and recorded abstentions 33. Therefore, this item is carried. Thank you very much, Synod. This now concludes this item of business, and Synod will be adjourned until 8:30, when members will be invited to return to the Central Hall to undertake voting process for the CNC. Members are reminded that they will need to bring a device, phone, laptop or a tablet for the voting.